So here's a question that's really fundamental. What's the connection between consciousness, being you and your physical body? It's something science and religion have wrestled with for, well, ages.
Right. And traditionally, you see this kind of split, don't you? Science often looks at the brain, the biology, our sort of wetware as the source of consciousness.
While many religions talk about something else entirely, a soul, maybe, something non-physical that goes beyond the body.
Exactly. But what if consciousness isn't strictly tied to the biological stuff? What if it's more about the pattern of information?
Ah, okay. That brings us to this idea of substrate independence.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Substrate independence basically proposes that consciousness could be an informational pattern. Think of it maybe like software that can run on different kinds of hardware. The pattern itself is what matters, not necessarily the specific material it's running on.
Interesting. So our goal today in this deep dive is to kind of explore that. Can this idea of substrate independence maybe bridge the gap between scientific views of the mind and religious concepts of the soul?
Yeah, we'll be looking at cognitive science, information theory, various religious traditions, even some emerging tech.
And it's not just philosophy, right? This could really change how we think about ourselves, about AI, even about, well, the possibility of transferring consciousness someday.
Absolutely. The implications are potentially huge.
Okay, let's get into it then. What's the bedrock of this substrate independence idea?
Well, at its core, it's saying consciousness isn't the stuff, the neurons, the chemicals, but the organization, the pattern of information processing.
Right. That fits with information theory, doesn't it? Studying information separate from the medium.
Exactly. And it links up with computational theories of mind, the idea that thinking is a kind of computation.
Like Alan Turing's work, the whole computational equivalence thing.
Precisely. Turing showed that what a system does, its function, can be separated from what it's made of. So computation happening in a brain could, in principle, happen in silicon or something else entirely.
Which leads to that philosophical idea, multiple realizability.
Yes, the same mental state, like feeling happy or seeing the color red, could theoretically exist or be realized in different physical systems. A human brain, maybe an advanced AI, maybe something totally alien. The feeling isn't intrinsically biological.
Okay, so let's bring in some specific scientific theories of consciousness. What about integrated information theory, IIT?
All right, Giulio Tononi's IIT. It's a fascinating and maybe radical idea. It says consciousness arises from the complexity and integration of information within a system.
So it's not what it's made of, but how interconnected it is.
Exactly. It proposes a mathematical measure phi for this integration. If a system, biological or not, reaches a certain threshold of phi, it would be conscious. It's about how much the system's information processing is more than the sum of its parts.
Interesting. And global workspace theory, how does that fit?
That's another functional approach from Bars and Dehaene. It views consciousness like a global broadcast system in the brain.
Broadcast system.
Yet, different specialized processors work on information, and when something becomes important enough, it gets broadcast to this global workspace, making it available across the system. Again, the focus is on the function, the broadcasting, the sharing, not the specific biological nuts and bolts.
So these theories, they all seem to nudge towards consciousness being about information flow,
Yeah.
about patterns, not just the wetware itself.
They do suggest that possibility, yes.
Yeah.
That the how might be more critical than the what.
But okay, theories are one thing. What actual empirical evidence hints that this kind of flexibility exists? Because, we can't just swap our brains out.
Right, and that's the huge challenge. Consciousness is subjective, hard to pin down experimentally. But we do have some really suggestive clues.
Like brain plasticity.
Exactly. When part of the brain is damaged, other areas can often take over those lost functions.
Yeah.
The brain literally rewires itself.
So the function isn't absolutely locked to one piece of tissue.
It suggests not. It implies a level of functional flexibility, almost like the brain can reroute its own software.
Okay, what else?
We'll look at artificial neural networks. The progress there is just astounding.
Sure, AI is advancing like crazy.
And while we're nowhere near saying they're conscious, these silicon systems can mimic aspects of brain-like information processing, learning, pattern recognition, even creativity. The fact that we can build something totally non-biological that does this stuff, it hints that the principles might be substrate neutral.
And those split brain studies, they always seemed kind of mind-bending.
They really are. Cutting the connection between the brain hemispheres can, in some cases, seem to result in two partially independent streams of awareness within one person. It suggests Consciousness isn't necessarily this single monolithic thing. It might be more divisible, more flexible than we assume.
What about psychedelics? People report these profound shifts in consciousness.
Right, without any structural brain damage. Psychedelics seem to alter the patterns of communication, the information flow within the brain, leading to radically different subjective experiences.
So it's about the dynamics, the information flow changing.
It strongly suggests that yes. Now, to be clear, none of this proves substrate independence definitively.
Sure, sure.
But taken together, these different lines of evidence point towards a surprising degree of flexibility. Consciousness seems less rigidly tied to specific biological hardware than we might have thought.
Okay, that builds a pretty interesting case from the scientific side. Let's pivot now. What about religious ideas of the soul? How do they resonate with this concept of patterns, of essence beyond just physical matter?
It's actually striking how many different traditions, despite vast theological differences, converge on this idea that the core of a person isn't just the physical body.
Let's start with the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. How do they view the soul?
Generally, they see the soul as something distinct from the body, often created by God, an immaterial essence. And crucially, it's often believed to persist after death.
Which implies it's not dependent on the biological substrate, right?
Exactly. The very idea of an afterlife where you continue suggests your essential identity isn't tied solely to your physical form. It's a kind of inherent substrate independence.
And the Christian concept of resurrection, that seems relevant too.
It is. The idea isn't just the soul floating off, but often involves a future re-embodiment in a transformed, perhaps glorified physical form. You could see that as the essential pattern of the person being reinstantiated in a new, different substrate.
And Jewish and Islamic afterlife concepts also talk about continuity of the person.
Yes, continuity of identity and consciousness in a state beyond physical death is central. The Uru persists across different modes of existence.
Okay, let's shift east. Hinduism and Buddhism, they seem to have very direct parallels.
They really do. Hinduism's concept of Atman, the eternal self or soul undergoing reincarnation, transmigrating from one body to another over lifetimes.
That sounds almost exactly like substrate independence, the same self-pattern in different hardware.
It's a very strong parallel. And Buddhism, interestingly, rejects the idea of a permanent, unchanging self or Atman.
Right, the doctrine of anatta, or no self.
Correct. But it still talks about a continuity of consciousness, a stream of awareness or mental moments that carries karmic imprints across lifetimes and rebirths. It's not a fixed soul, but a dynamic process, a continuous pattern of information and causation.
Which actually sounds a bit like some of those information processing models of mind we discussed earlier.
It does, surprisingly so. The focus is on the process, the pattern of becoming, rather than a static entity.
And Taoism, where does that fit?
Taoism often emphasizes the underlying principles or patterns, the Tao, that manifest in all things, beyond just the physical forms. There's a sense that consciousness, like everything else, is part of this deeper flow, this pattern, not limited to its material expression.
It's fascinating, too, how many indigenous traditions seem to share this idea, the spirit leaving the body, maybe.
Absolutely. Concepts of the spirit, soul, or life force being able to travel outside the physical body, for instance during dreams, trances, or shamanic journeys, are common in many traditional cultures.
Again, implying consciousness isn't absolutely tethered to the physical form.
Precisely. So, across these diverse religious and spiritual landscapes, you see these recurring motifs. Identity continuing beyond the body, consciousness being potentially separable, and the self being understood as some kind of enduring pattern or essence, rather than just the physical stuff.
Okay, this is really bringing things together. If consciousness could be substrate independent, theoretically, well, that opens the door to some wild technological ideas, doesn't it?
It certainly inspires some ambitious technological projects, yes.
Like whole brain emulation, WBE.
That's probably the most famous or infamous one. The idea is if consciousness arises from the brain's structure and activity, then if you could map a specific brain in enough detail, every neuron, every connection.
Like perfectly scan it.
Yeah, scan it with incredible fidelity, and then simulate that exact structure and its dynamics on a powerful enough computer.
You could essentially reboot that person's consciousness on the computer.
That's the theory. It rests heavily on the assumption that consciousness is fundamentally computational and emerges from those specific brain processes.
But the challenges must be, Well, astronomical.
Oh, absolutely immense. The sheer complexity of the brain, the
Hmm.
level of detail needed for the scan, the computational power required for the simulation, we're nowhere near being able to do it now. But it serves as a kind of ultimate test case for substrate independence.
What about less all-or-nothing approaches, neural interfaces?
Right. Brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs, offer a potentially more gradual path. We're already seeing early versions helping people with paralysis, for example.
Sure.
Now imagine much more advanced interfaces that seamlessly integrate biological brain function with external artificial systems.
Hmm.
You could potentially offload cognitive tasks, augment memory.
And maybe, eventually, replace biological parts with artificial ones that perform the same function.
That's the speculative endpoint. A gradual transition where, bit by bit, biological neural tissue is replaced by functionally equivalent artificial components. The hope there is that identity could be preserved throughout the process, avoiding the philosophical shock of an instantaneous upload.
That leads to the idea of building artificial consciousness from the ground up, right? Not copying, but creating.
Exactly. If we can figure out the necessary and sufficient conditions, the core informational patterns for consciousness, maybe we don't need to copy a messy biological brain. Maybe we can design and implement those patterns directly in silicon or some other substrate.
But that hinges on really understanding what consciousness is at that fundamental pattern level.
Precisely. It requires a much deeper theoretical understanding than just copying an existing system.
And these digital afterlife concepts, they seem a bit different.
They're generally more limited in scope. They're less about transferring full subjective consciousness and more about preserving aspects of a person digitally.
Like creating an interactive avatar based on someone's writings, social media, maybe interviews.
Kind of like that, yes. Creating a legacy system that captures personality traits, memories, ways of speaking. It explores the persistence of personal patterns in a digital form, but typically doesn't claim to replicate the actual conscious experience. It's more about preserving a representation.
All these possibilities, they just force you to ask fundamental questions about identity. What does it mean to be you if your consciousness could theoretically be moved or copied?
Exactly. We bump right into deep philosophical territory. It's the ship of Theseus problem, but applied to the mind.
Right, the ship where every plank is replaced. Is it still the same ship?
Apply that to consciousness. If the physical basis changes, gradually or suddenly, but the pattern of thoughts, memories, personality continues, is it still you?
What are the main ways people think about that continuity?
Well, one view is pattern continuity. If the essential informational pattern persists, that's enough for identity to continue, regardless of the substrate. You are your pattern.
Okay.
Then there's causal continuity. This view adds that it's not enough for the pattern to be similar. There needs to be a direct causal link. My mental state now must be directly caused by my mental state a moment ago. A perfect copy, created separately, wouldn't be me, even if it had an identical pattern, because it doesn't share my causal history.
I see. So the history matters, not just the snapshot.
Exactly. And then there's the embodied perspective, which argues that identity is deeply tied to our specific physical body and the unique way we interact with the world through it. From this view, changing the substrate might fundamentally change who you are, or maybe make continuity impossible.
These debates sound a bit like religious discussions about the soul surviving death or resurrection, actually.
There are definite parallels, yes. Questions about what constitutes the essential self that persists across different states of being.
But the technological possibility of copying consciousness, that seems to really throw a wrench in traditional ideas of a unique soul.
It absolutely does. If you can duplicate the pattern, potentially creating multiple, subjectively identical instances of consciousness, well, most traditional religious frameworks posit a single unique soul per person.
So which one is the real you? Do copies have the same rights? It gets very complicated very fast.
Extremely. It challenges core assumptions about individuality and uniqueness that are deeply embedded in both philosophical and religious thought. What defines originality or identity when perfect duplication is possible? We don't have easy answers.
And what about consciousness not being stuck in one place? Hybrid identities, maybe.
That's another fascinating implication.
Yeah.
Could consciousness span multiple substrates? Could part of your mind run on your biological brain while another part runs on a connected neural implant or even a remote server? Could your cognitive self extend beyond your skull?
Like the extended mind idea in philosophy.
Exactly. Like the idea that our tools, notebooks, smartphones, maybe future BCIs, can become genuine parts of our cognitive processes, Substrate independence could take that to a whole new level. It also resonates, in a way, with some Eastern ideas about interconnectedness, the self not being rigidly bounded.
Wow. Okay. This feels like we're really pushing the boundaries of how we even frame these questions.
It does suggest we might need a more integrated framework, doesn't it?
Which leads to this idea you mentioned, consciousness as informational soul. Can you unpack that a bit?
It's an attempt to find common ground. The idea is to reframe the concept of the soul, not as some kind of spooky, supernatural substance, but perhaps as our intuitive grasp of the complex, integrated information pattern that constitutes our selfhood.
So the soul is the pattern, the unique way our information is organized and processed.
Potentially, yes. It suggests that the age-old intuition about an essence that defines us, something beyond just flesh and bone, might actually be pointing towards this incredibly complex informational structure that science is now beginning to grapple with. It sees the religious concept as maybe an early pre-scientific insight into the pattern-based nature of mind.
And this allows for different levels of understanding.
Exactly. You can have nested patterns of emergence, from basic physics up through chemistry, biology, neural networks, and finally to the integrated patterns of conscious thought and experience. Science can work from the bottom up, explaining the mechanisms.
While philosophy and religion can explore the top-down aspects, the meaning, the value, the subjective reality of that emergent pattern.
Precisely. They aren't necessarily competing explanations, but complementary perspectives on different facets of the same phenomenon, consciousness as an informational pattern. Science describes the implementation. Religion and philosophy explore the experience and its significance.
So seeing consciousness as information, as pattern, it offers a potential bridge, a common language.
That's the hope. It doesn't magically resolve all the deep disagreements, of course, but it might provide a framework where scientific and religious or philosophical perspectives can engage more productively, focusing on the structure and dynamics of information, rather than arguing about incompatible substances.
It feels like a potentially very fruitful way forward, especially as technology keeps pushing these boundaries whether we're ready or not.
The ethical considerations alone make this dialogue urgent.
Absolutely. So, wrapping up, this idea of substrate independence, viewing consciousness as potentially an informational pattern, it really does seem to open up new avenues for conversation between science and spirituality.
It suggests the ancient concept of the soul and the modern scientific quest to understand the mind might be converging on a similar underlying reality, the profound importance of information and pattern in defining who we are.
It's a powerful thought. So if our essence truly is informational, what does that mean for our potential, for our place in the cosmos? It certainly leaves you with a lot to think about regarding your own being.
Indeed it does. What new questions does it raise for you?
Definitely food for thought. Thanks for digging into this with me today.